For centuries, virginity was treated like a contract. A woman's worth reduced to a single moment she could never quite control. Entire families built their honor around it, and entire religions wrote rules around it. And somehow, the story always ended with her body as the battleground. Meanwhile, men, their purity was never questioned. Their value was never measured in silence, or blood, or shame. It's almost absurd, except it still lingers, in whispers, in laws, in the way so many of us were raised. This conversation isn't about biology. It's about myths we have inherited without asking where they came from, and about the quiet rebellion of naming them for what they are. No wonder women carry guilt that was never theirs. No wonder intimacy can feel like a test instead of a choice. No wonder we are done pretending this bargain was sacred. I'm Junie, and this is No Wonder. Today we're talking about virginity, not as morality, but as folklore, and what happens when we finally let it go. Before we dive in, let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like feminism is this huge confusing topic where you don't really know where you fit? If this hits home, you're exactly in the right place. Hit subscribe so you don't miss another conversation where we break down those walls and we find our path together. Sally Field opened up to the media. The first time I made love, I felt bad. I felt dirty. Maybe every girl goes through that. Sally Field is the actress from The Amazing Spider-Man, if you know, Aunt May. And I feel like that's how deep the story of virginity runs in us. It gets under your skin even before you know it's there. And that's exactly why I'm here today. I started No Wonder because I don't want us to keep carrying these myths in silence. I want to pick them apart, laugh at them, grieve them if need to, and most of all, take back the pen so that we can rewrite our own definitions. And honestly, I am so excited that you're here with me today, because this podcast isn't just about my voice. It's about building a space where our questions, our stories, and our truths finally have room to breathe. So here's the thing. This episode isn't about trashing tradition or telling anyone to believe. It's more like, let's just stop and think about what we've all grown up thinking about virginity. It's never really been about sex itself. It's been a tool, a way to measure people, police choices, or keep control. And it's wild how often that has been wrapped up and sold to us as love and devotion. What I want from this conversation today isn't for anyone to feel like their experience isn't valid. It's more about saying intimacy is not a scorecard. It's not a performance, it's just yours. Full stop. And it has always been. There is an asymmetry that defines the narrative. Controlling one's virginity, a power or a prison? Culturally and socially, it's constructed primarily as a marker of female purity, honor, and tightly linked to controlling women's sexuality and behavior. Women's virginity is often linked to family honor, marriageability, and social status, creating an intense pressure to conform to these expectations of sexual purity. Female virginity loss frequently involves shame, stigma, and sometimes social or physical punishments, functioning then as a form of social prison, limiting women's autonomy. In contrast, male virginity is rarely viewed as a moral or social concern. Instead, male sexual experiences are seen as success, a symbol of masculinity, virility, and social success again. Men face societal pressures to prove masculinity through sexual conquests, with virginity sometimes being stigmatized as failure or inadequacy. This creates a different kind of social prison that is centered around performance. My question to you now is, given what I am about to tell you, does virginity really need to hold the weight that it does? Different cultures assign varying levels of importance to female virginity based on historical, economic, and social factors. In many traditions, for example, in the Middle East, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, virginity before marriage is a crucial marker of honor, social status, and marriageability. Conversely, there are some cultures like the Maasai from the East Africa that do not value virginity at all and may even expect premarital sexual experiences to consider for marriage eligibility. There are religious influences in the virginity norms as well. Major religions like Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Sikhism often emphasize female chastity in the doctrines and practices. However, within religions, attitudes toward virginity can be contested and are evolving. Reformist or liberal religions may reject virginity as policing, focusing instead on consent and mutual respect. Conservative leaders and communities may, however, double down on virginity as a safeguard of moral conduct. There is also a difference between urban and rural contexts. Rural areas often maintain stronger adherence to traditional virginity norms due to closer-knit communities, lower exposure to globalized ideas, and centrality of family or religion. Urban centers do tend to see more liberal attitudes, influenced by education, media, secularism, and diverse populations. Virginity then may lose its moral strictness, with young people adopting more individualistic or egalitarian views. Migration experiences often create hybrid identities, where individuals navigate between traditional family expectation and modern urban values. The social stratification of virginity. Within the same culture or religion, views on virginity can vary by social class, educational level, and generation. Educated and wealthier urban population are often less likely to prioritize virginity as a precondition for marriage, compared to lower income and rural areas. Younger generations nowadays, worldwide, tend to question or even reject virginity norms, though they might still face familiar or community pressures. How is feminism deconstructing the myth of virginity? I'm saying the myth because we're about to say that virginity has no anatomical relevance. Because feminism highlights that there is no medical or biological basis to state virginity. Because the state of the hymen or the genitalia cannot objectively indicate prior sexual experiences. So the belief that virginity loss involves breaking or damage is scientifically false and harmful because it reinforces the damaging myths around bodies, especially women's. This myth also ignores the diversity of sexual experiences that exist out there, their identities, and the bodies, including the known heteronormative sexualities, meaning that virginity is currently defined only by penis in vagina penetration exclusionary. Virginity is also a social construct because it's framed as a patriarchal tool that normalizes gender stereotypes, perpetuates a binary moral framework where women's worth is tied to their sexual history. Feminists argue that virginity norms reinforced hetero-cis sexism by prioritizing heterosexual, penetrative sex and erasing or at least marginalizing queer and non-binary communities. Virginity myths also sustain rape culture by portraying women as vessels, needing them to be protected until they get claimed by someone through heterosexual sex. There is also an evolving discourse about sexuality, as I've just hinted, because the feminist movement promotes sexual autonomy, challenging shame, stigma, and the policing associated with virginity. There is growing resistance to virginity as a defining milestone, favoring concepts like consent, pleasure, and mutual respect as the central of a healthy relationship and sexuality. Feminism also encourages exploring and validating a diversity of sexual experiences beyond the traditional losing the virginity type. This evolving discourse works to dismantle the oppressive rhetoric and provides an inclusive language and education around sexuality that tries to affirm all genders and sexual orientations. The feminist discourse then wants to reform sexuality as a choice. But nowadays, what are currently the choices that people are making in regard to their virginity? There are numerous cultural practices worldwide that surround the myth and the social construct of virginity. The first one being virginity testing and the proof of virginity. It's common in parts of Asia, Middle East, Northern and Southern Africa, and in some immigrant communities worldwide. And it involves physical examination of the hymen to determine if it is intact, based on the false assumption, as we saw, that an unbroken hymen signifies virginity. Methods for this virginity testing include visual inspection and the controversial two fingers test, which assesses vaginal laxity, supposedly indicating sexual history. Often performed by doctors, community leaders, or elder women, and sometimes forcibly imposed on girls and women for marriage eligibility or social control. This is widely criticized as medically unscientific, invasive, and a human right violation by the WHO, the UN Women, and human rights organizations all over the world. Virginity testing, however, still retains some legal status and implicit social acceptance in parts of the world, despite the call for international bans. In some culture, the proof of virginity after marriage consummation is also required and might involve displaying blood-stained sheets for confirming that virginity was actually happening during the first night of intercourse. Such rituals serve as social proof of purity and family honor, but are unreliable as not all women bleed during their first intercourse. In parts of Africa and Asia, virginity testing can be linked to rites of passage or celebration of making a girl's transition into womanhood. Hymenoplasty is a surgical procedure born to restore or reconstruct the hymen to give the appearance of virginity. It's commonly sought in society with strong virginity norms and where marriage prospects or honor depend on its intactness. Religious and cultural attitudes towards the surgery vary. Some condemn it as deceitful, and others accept it in a way of preserving social respect. The surgery can involve risks, but remains popular due to its social pressures. There are traditional remedies and there are behavioral adaptations surrounding virginity. Traditional remedies and ritual are historical or folk practices that include applying herbal powders, tightening substances, or undergoing rituals intended to simulate virginity or prevent the hymen from breaking. Some cultures use symbolic ceremonies to reaffirm virginity as a status or to reaffirm modesty, which can include some communal rites or festivals. Behavioral adaptations see women engaging in non-penetrative sexual practices to maintain the traditional hymen-related notions of virginity. And some communities even reinforces dress codes, limit social interactions, or impose strict controls on women to preserve their virginity. At this point, I would like to say that when I was researching, I noticed that virginity is two-faced, because there is a divide where most fall in the middle. The first side is a rebellion against the purity standards. In response to oppressive purity norms and the policing of female virginity, some women enact a form of rebellion by embracing sexual activity early and openly. This almost seems like a hypersexualization that involves having multiple sexual partners, even premature sexual activities maybe, or rejecting the traditional ideas of modesty, consciously or unconsciously, by challenging the imposed purity. This is supposed to serve as a rejection of the patriarchal control, asserting agency over one's body and their sexuality, defying restrictive social expectations. However, this rebellion can still expose women to judgment, stigma, and objectification as society continues today to police female sexuality harshly. The hypersexualization is complex, and I can't explain it all here, right now, because it's both a form of empowerment and a reaction to a strict dichotomy of purity culture that limits women's sexual expression. There's the other side, abstinence as a form of rebellion or empowerment. Abstaining from sex or valuing virginity can be a deliberate, empowering choice to reject the societal pressure of hypersexualization. For some women, maintaining virginity can serve as a way of reclaiming one's autonomy and self-respect, resisting the objectification and the sexual commodification. This form of abstinence positions virginity as an act of personal agency rather than a social obligation or moral value imposed from the outside. Abstinence can challenge both the slut-shaming and the assumption that women's value depends on sexual activity or availability. It represents a refusal to be defined by patriarchal narratives of sexual impurity, making it a meaningful form of rebellion. Feminist discourse support abstinence as empowering only when it's a free, conscious choice, not coerced or shamed. There are tensions and contradictions, as women often exist under this double blind of being shamed whether they conform to the sexualized norms or choose abstinence. Both hypersexualization and abstinence can be instruments of control, but abstinence as rebellion reframes the narrative around empowerment and consent. However, we've had all of this large discourse of sex, but there is a fact that we are not considering. Socially, we're having less and less of it. I would like now to bring I was hesitating there because I'm now bringing a subject that can be a little delicate. The manosphere and the rising of sexual inactivity. What frustration does to the young generation. The manosphere is a network of online communities, including incels, men's rights activists, and pickup artists, defined by misogynistic attitudes and anti-feminism rhetoric, centered on the perceived male sexual disenfranchisement, which is the act of taking away rights. The manosphere frames sexuality as a sexual marketplace, ranking men by their sexual market value, where a successful alpha male dominates sexuality, where others, for example incels, feel excluded and powerless. Male virginity is stigmatized in the manosphere, as it's seen as social failure, undermining masculinity, fueling men's desperation to prove sexual competence and manhood through conquests. Growing sexual inactivity among younger generations, especially men, corresponds with feelings of alienation, discussed in the manosphere. Many report fewer or no sexual experiences well into adulthood due to social, economic, and cultural changes. This inactivity, combined with the manosphere ideology, creates a cycle of resentment, entitlement, and mistrust toward women and society, reinforcing these toxic narratives. The manosphere's focus on sexual deprivation adds complexity to already the complex traditional virginity discourse, which historically just emphasizes the control over women's sexuality. But now we're seeing that men face pressure to achieve sexual activity, while women face policing for sexual purity. The social and psychological fallout of all of this includes increased misogyny, social polarization, and difficulty forming healthy and intimate relationships, sometimes escalating in real-world violence. Addressing this requires reframing virginity and sexuality towards consent, autonomy, and mutual respect, breaking cycles of shame and entitlement that harm all genders. So let's have a recap here. Virginity is not biological, but a social construct, which is heavily weighted with patriarchal values that disproportionately regulate women's body and sexuality, while imposing different sexual expectations from men. Across religious and cultural contexts, virginity symbolizes family honor, morality, social order, with enforcement varying widely between rural and urban environments, tradition, and generational attitudes. Cultural practices such as virginity testing, hymen repair, and rituals enforce virginity's social significance, but are increasingly challenged as medically unfounded and human rights violations. Feminism critically deconstructs the virginity myth by exposing its anatomical irrelevance, revealing it as a tool for patriarchal control, and advocating for sexual autonomy, having diverse experiences, and dismantling the shame and stigma mentioned. The manosphere and the rising of sexual inactivity among young adults inject new dimension to the virginity discourse, sexual access, revealing masculine anxiety about sexual access and contributing to polarized gender dynamics rooted in entitlement and disenfranchisement. Female virginity is caught between two polar views: the hypersexualization as a rebellion against purity policing, where premature or extensive sexual activity challenges restrictive norms, and the other side, abstinence, as an empowered personal choice or resistance to objectification. Both hypersexualization and abstinence can be a form of rebellion, but also reflect the double binds that women face in navigating sexual identity among societal pressures and contradictory expectations. I now have a final question for you. What if virginity stopped being a measure of value and became just a matter of freedom of choice? Because the body is no longer the battlefield. What are the future outlooks for this whole situation? So, looking ahead, virginity as a concept is poised to fragment and diversify significantly society, because it will be shaped more and more by evolving social, cultural, and individual understanding. The traditional narrow definition of virginity, centered around penile vaginal intercourse, will continue to be challenged, especially by expanding recognition of diverse sexual orientation, identities, and experiences. Younger generation will increasingly regard virginity as fluid, personal, and subjective, rejecting the rigid labels tied to gender morality or purity, embracing instead a broader spectrum of intimate and relational milestones. Technological, medical, and social advances will facilitate more nuanced conversations about sexuality, freeing virginity from its historical role as a marker of moral worth or social control. Cultural and religious meanings of virginity will persist, but even within this context, interpretation will vary, reflecting the generational shifts, the urbanization, and the globalization. Despite fragmentation, a clear commitment to personal agency must become the ultimate standard. Empowering individuals to define virginity or intimacy meanings on their own terms, free from stigma, coercion, and policing. And this emphasis on agency includes recognizing the diverse experiences, including the LGBTQ+ realities, the abstinence by choice, the consensual sexual exploration. And this is also gonna include honoring individual stories without moral judgment. Moving forward, the conversation should then center consent, self-definition, and respect, rather than externally imposed purity standards or binary judgment. If today's talk hit something inside, then that's exactly why you should subscribe. Every episode is here to support you, unfiltered, real, and raw. And if you know someone who's on the same path, you should share this episode with them, because from now on, they no longer have to figure this out alone. In sum, the future of virginity lies not in fixed definitions or collective impositions, but in embracing its plurality and affirming that sexual agency and autonomy reign supreme as the guiding values of how people understand and live their intimate lives. So what's the real story behind it all? Virginity, that fragile crown placed on a woman's head, was never gold, it was glass. Shiny, brittle, and designed to shudder the moment she stepped out of line. Yes, it was dressed in lace and hymns, paraded as purity, whispered about like secret treasures. But at its core, it was never holiness, it was property law with a prettier name. Real intimacy, real power doesn't begin with sheets stained in red or rules handed down. It begins when the myth loses its grip, when we choose our stories, our bodies, and our joy without waiting for anyone's permission. The candles are burning low tonight, but the dialogue shouldn't fade. This is no wonder, where we laugh at the old scripts, cut through the smoke, and toast the truth that they tried to hide under velvet curtains. Until next time, keep your questions sharp, your freedom non-negotiable, and let your laughter echo louder than the rules. Good night.